We have a large T-Rex head in our museum in Little Rock that we'd like to invite everybody to come to see. It's about 6 feet from front to back, pivots with these huge banana-shaped teeth. The kids come up and look at it, and my wife and I stand back and count the wows. But the point we make as they look at that dinosaur that's just huge and awesome is that, yes, that's a wow, that's awesome. You certainly wouldn't argue with such a creature. But just understand there's something even more awesome, and that's the one that created him. And you don't want to argue with him ever. And hopefully that sinks in. I think that's one of the messages of the dinosaurs. They show God's awesome power. We're talking about the record of the rocks tonight. And I think back when I started preaching, I was always interested in science. I thought I was through with school after 4 years of studying the Bible, and began to talk about creation science and found out it helped to know what I was talking about. And went back to school. And one of the things that confronted me was evidence from geology. That seemed to be the greatest challenge. And we didn't have people among us who were geologists, places where I could go to get answers. And so I rolled up my sleeves and went after it, and 15 years later I got finished. But I think we found answers, and I think the evidence from geology is much stronger on our side. I think it belongs to us and is faith strengthening. And we want to show you some of that this evening. When we talk about rocks, we're talking about sedimentary rocks tonight. I'd like to talk about some of the others as well, but these are rocks that are laid down by water. And you see horizontal layers indicating that when you drive along the highway and look at the road cuts. It covers the continents, that is, the sedimentary rocks do, to an average thickness of about 1.5 miles. Some places they don't exist, other places up to 5 miles, but an average of about 1.5 miles covering all the continents. Now, how did that come to be? Water-laid rock covering the continents to a depth of about 1.5 miles with billions and billions of dead things in it. Well, I think there's a pretty good, obvious explanation for those that believe the Bible, but of course our evolutionists tell us that that's not the case unless they get off the earth and they're talking about sedimentary rocks upon Mars. I think the implication is obvious, and they're not guarding against it. Here from Discover, we're told about catastrophic floods that rapidly covered the surface of Mars. And why do they say that? Well, they got these horizontal layers laid down by water, and there's no water up there now. But that's their explanation. That's what it looks like. In Nature 2020, they talk about Mars' Noachian stratigraphic record, referring, of course, to Noah. Because they're looking at these horizontal layers, and that's what that looks like. But you get to the Earth where 70% of the surface is covered by oceans, and no floods. It's slow and gradual, and this built up layer by layer over millions of years, reflecting then this picture of a progression from simple to complex in the rock record. I think there's a much better explanation. I think the catastrophic flood, a year-long series of depositions, produced that rock record, that it's a flood deposit, rather than the slow, gradual record of millions of years. So let's look at that record and see if we can see which of those two views is supported by the evidence. This is the picture that represents the evolutionary thinking, indicating that this simple beginning gradually grew more complex over millions of years, supposed to represent the gradual development. The biggest problem with this representation that you see in the textbooks is that you can't find it anywhere on the face of the earth. It doesn't exist in the earth. It is a mental abstraction, as it's referred to. Notice the statement by Leighton Judson in their geology text: because we cannot find sedimentary rocks representing all of Earth time in one convenient area. Now that's profound in itself. Cannot find all of the rocks in one place. Which is what I just said, and people hear me say it and they say, wait a minute, that can't be. Well, here's the geology text saying it. We must piece together the rock sequence from locality to locality. This process of tying one rock sequence in one place to another in some other place is known as correlation, and I think that's off the chart there, sorry. The end product of correlation, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, is a mental abstraction called the geologic column. Correlation is described here by R.H. Rastell in Cambridge in terms of the major fallacy. How do they correlate? How do they stack it together? How do they know which rock you piece together at the bottom and which one goes in the middle? Well, if you're an evolutionist, of course, the simple goes on the bottom, right? And then that's the way you stack it. R.H. Rastell of Cambridge in the Encyclopedia Britannica says it cannot be denied that geologists are here arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms has been determined by a study of the remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the organisms they contain. I think when we transfer this over, we lose some of the formatting, but I think we can work with that. To illustrate what he just said, a person says this is a primitive rock. Okay, how do you know that's a primitive rock? Well, it's found in an old rock, and so it's got to be a primitive fossil because it's in an old rock. Well, how do you know it's an old rock? Well, it's got a primitive fossil in it, you see, and round and round you go. If you know evolution is so, and if you've got progressions, then that would work, but you don't, and that's the way they start and the way they stack it. David Rapp, who is curator of the Field Museum of Natural History, the largest fossil museum in the United States, this thing is working without me punching it, so getting ahead of me. He says in the years after Darwin, his advocates hoped to find predictable progressions. In general, these have not been found. Yet the optimism has died hard. Some pure fantasy has crept into the textbooks. Now, that's what he's talking about, and it's fantasy in that this is the mental abstraction that comes with the assumption of evolution that allows them to stack it together and make it look like evolution. But the progression that they hope to find, the curator for the largest fossil museum in the United States says they have not been found. And the representation that we see is certainly a very skewed, distorted picture for several reasons. For one thing, we're looking at mostly vertebrates, animals with backbones, and the fossil record is mostly not vertebrates. It's about 95% marine invertebrates. They don't want it to look like that, and so that's not the way it's represented. Of the 5% that's not there, 4.5% is plants and animals. Actually, vertebrates constitute less than, or about 1/100th of 1%, but that's the whole column. Well, why would they do that? And of that 1/100th of 1%, most of that's fish. We're looking at a flood deposit, and they don't want it to look like a flood deposit, and so they don't tell it that way. I think that represents what we're looking at much more accurately. The Genesis flood, which actually began the creation movement in the United States, at least in large form, published in '61 by Whitcomb and Morris, explained geology in terms of the flood. John C. McCampbell, who was head of the Department of Geology at the University of Southeastern Louisiana, wrote the foreword to this book. He's an atheist, he's a devout evolutionist, but he acknowledged in the foreword that the facts of geology do fit and that they built a very strong case for this explanation and presented a very serious challenge to the typical evolutionary explanation. That book has been updated, and John Morris is the author, the son of Henry Morris, of this most recent update, which I think brings it up to date with the latest information. Highly recommended. But let's look quickly at some of the questions that come when you say this is a flood deposit. Well, where did all the water come from that formed the flood? Well, we have plenty of water. Jacques Cousteau is one of the leading authorities. He's passed on, but he says, were the crust of the earth leveled out? Now, this is not working the way it's supposed to. I'm not advancing that. Jacques Cousteau says, were the crust to be leveled out, evened out, no land would show above the surface of the sea. The earth would be covered by a uniform sheet of water more than 10,000 feet deep. So if you had the earth like a ball bearing, 10,000 feet of water, that's about 2 miles. Plenty of water. Well, okay, that's what covered the earth, but where did it go? Why is it not still there? And I think we have a description of the process from Psalm 104. And here is the model that we put forth and test to see if it fits. You covered it with the deep, speaking of the earth, as with a garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they hurried away. So here's the water above the mountains, the flood. God spoke, they hurried away. The mountains rose and the valleys sank down. Now, let's just use some crude illustrations here to see if we can visualize this. We're told that there were waters above the firmament initially, and then there were mountains and there were oceans. I'm proposing mile-deep oceans prior to the flood and mile-high mountains. So you could speak of the oceans and the mountains. But the firmament, the waters above came down. At least that's one of the proposals. Some of it came from the fountains below. The mountains rose and the valleys sank down. So you've got mountains now up to 5 miles high. And the ocean basins sank down. Instead of a mile deep, they averaged 3 miles deep. Now, an extra 2 miles in an area covering 70% of the Earth's surface would hold a lot of water, wouldn't it? That's where the water went. But when the flood inundated this world, it covered the world as it was at that time and buried the things where they lived. Things at the bottom of the ocean are not buried with things that live out on the plains. The worldwide flood would do that, and so it buries the lowest things first, and there would be a general order, certainly not without exceptions and not as detailed as presented in the textbooks, but they're separated not because they live millions of years apart, but because natural habitats segregate. You don't have antelopes living where the coral is. So ecological zones are preserved because they were buried together. I think that fits the picture of a flood deposit perfectly. If we impose this view on what they represent as the column, it looks something like this, but not the detailed picture that you see in the textbooks, which is based on the circular logic, the assumption of evolution to build it. So this is a skewed conceptual correlation that because it's based on circular logic is useless as proof. It is useful, however, as a model, and beginning with the assumption is what you do. When you put the model forth, then you test it to see if these things fit. Well, how do you test this idea? As M. Stanley of Johns Hopkins says, you test it with topsy-turvy fossils. He said the topsy-turvy fossils, and things supposed to be up, down, things supposed to be down, up, would disprove evolution. Any topsy-turvy sequence of fossils would force us to rethink our theory. Well, we find a lot of the what we'll call topsy fossils, things supposed to be down found up, which they don't really talk about that much. That's not uncommon. One obvious example is the horseshoe crab. Here, 2021, we have a description in Nature. The oldest actual fossils of horseshoe crabs date to the Ordovician, 450. That's almost right down at the bottom. Remarkably, extant species remain relatively unchanged morphologically, their shape, since this extreme ancient age. Now, we find Niles Eldredge writing a book about living fossils. There are that many like that were down but still alive today. No change in any part we can compare, and he says we haven't really solved that problem. Keith Thompson, who was president of the Academy of Natural Sciences, talks about the horseshoe crab and compares the fossil. We have an excellent fossil in our museum. They look quite like what? Modern forms. And then says, amazingly, the last fossils became extinct about 50 million years ago. Wait a minute, fossils don't become extinct, but I know what he means. 50 million years ago, you don't, back to that point in the geologic column, they disappear and you don't find anything above that, which means they should have gone extinct, but they're all over the place today. We find many horseshoe crabs, and so it began down near the bottom and disappeared 50 million years from now, but they're still all over the place. Now that's a challenge for their explanation. But it is an example of that which is supposed to be down found up, the topsy fossil. And the concept falsifies the extinction hypothesis, that is, that things are supposed to be extinct because they disappear from the column at one point. I think that's where they lived, and the flood buried them, and some of them are still alive today. I think that fits the facts better. It's interesting to consider this supposedly primitive creature and how advanced they are. Now, we're just having all kinds of challenges, and I'm not sure what this is about. All right, let's notice what's said here about this creature that began down near the bottom of the column, which therefore would be very primitive to fight off infection. The horseshoe crab has a compound in its blood which immediately binds and clots around fungi, viruses, bacterial endotoxins, and has become the worldwide standard for a screening test for bacterial contamination. It can detect 1 part per trillion. Now that's what you have to have if you're trying to find out if there's bacteria or contaminants. Every drug certified by the FDA must be tested using the LAL, that's the blood from the horseshoe crab, as do surgical implants, pacemakers, prosthetic devices. Without it, medicine faces a return to the dark ages. We haven't been able to advance and can't improve on it. In Live Science 2021, they did find one so well preserved that they could still see its brain in the horseshoe crab. Researchers surprised they found the ancient brain remarkably similar to that of a modern. They couldn't tell the difference between that and the modern horseshoe crab. So, yeah, we find things down that are now up and running around. That's not uncommon. But the real challenge that they acknowledge to be a challenge is the opposite. That which is supposed to be up, that is found down, which I think logically is basically the same thing, but they understand if it hadn't evolved yet, you can't find it down here. That's just not possible, and so we'll call that the Turvey fossil. Here is Richard Dawkins saying we'd be very surprised, for example, to find fossil humans appearing in the record before mammals are supposed to evolve. He says the whole modern theory of evolution would be utterly destroyed. Now, they don't normally stick their neck out like that, but it's amazing how they defend that position. In Newsweek, he said evolution could be so easily disproved if a single fossil turned up in the wrong date order. Just one single fossil in the wrong stratum would rip it. Because if you find that, then it's obviously the things that hadn't evolved yet up near the top of the column found down. That's just not going to work. Well, we have found that as well often. For example, one of the more dramatic examples, almost exactly what he proposed, near LaSalle, Utah, south of Moab, 11 human skeletons buried in the same layer where you find the dinosaurs, supposed to be separated by 100 million years. Dinosaur National Monument has the Dakota sandstone as one of its primary layers, and that's what we find here, about 100 miles south of that. But here are the modern fossils in the Dakota sandstone. We went back, and they, of course, say, well, you can't have humans and dinosaurs together. They must have fallen down a crack or crawled back in a cave, a mine cave in. So we went back to investigate. You see the backhoe here, 50 feet down in the Dakota sandstone. We found more of these human fossils. Now, this one is articulated, that is, together as in life. Most of them are just washed into place like these bones. They're bright green, which indicate replacement with malachite, certainly not a recent burial. There's no collagen in them at all, which would indicate at least 1,000 years buried. Quick and dirty way to know that they're old. This bone that I'm holding, I just pulled out of the sandstone and washed it off with a canteen. Some of it is jewelry grade turquoise, but they're perfectly modern, and they're buried in the same layer with dinosaurs. That is the Turvey fossil that he proposes that would utterly destroy evolution, disprove evolution. Well, but they're intrusionally buried. How do you know? Well, they have to be, because dinosaurs and humans didn't live together. There's no evidence of that. Mine cave-in is probably the favorite explanation. But of the 11, 4 of them are females. 1 of them is an infant. There are no tools and no broken bones. Now, that doesn't sound like a mine cave-in, does it? Sounds like these are the ones that missed the boat. Think about that a minute. He continues saying, ironically, it's also the reason why creationists are so keen on the fake human footprints which were carved during the Depression to fool tourists in the dinosaur beds of Texas. Now, he's sure they're fake. We've invited him to come look at them, and he hasn't. But this is really more important than the bones. You wouldn't initially think that, but bones can be eroded, redeposited, intrusionally buried. But you can't do that with footprints, can you? You erode them, they're gone. You can't reposition them. And so when we look at footprints, this is really more definitive. Dinosaur Valley State Park has the Paluxy River flowing through it and has eroded down to a layer which has all kinds of dinosaur tracks in it. Here's a fellow sitting in it. They were made famous back in the 1940s by Roland T. Byrd of the American Museum of Natural History, who said in Scientific American, In 1947, here's all of these dinosaur tracks, and we've got tracks there that look like human tracks. He didn't know better than to just say that, got in trouble for it, but they thought, of course, he was mistaken. But some very interesting tracks. This one particularly is three-dimensional, raised upward. How does that happen? Most tracks you press down, right? But if the second layer filled in and covered it, and it was harder when it became rock, and then subsequently erosion exposes the matrix, erodes away and leaves the raised center, which is important for a point that we'll be making later, but this is raised infill. Many of them are, wow, what in the world does that look like? That's not hard to figure out. But this had to be carved. Maybe the Indians carved them for some unimaginable reason. Stan Taylor in the 70s, early 70s, decided to test that hypothesis by following a couple of tracks that he saw out in the river back up under the riverbank. 6 feet of alternating clay and limestone and clay and limestone to see if they continued up under the overburden, and they did. He uncovered 12 tracks. We've uncovered 2 more since then. Looking closely, you can see the mud push-up around the central track. That's not carved. That looks like something that was an imprint in the softer clay when it first hardened. The one that really impressed me was this one. I was trying to play the devil's advocate. How could we answer this? But here is the dinosaur track that's about 25 inches, and then stepping right in the middle of it. Wow. There's all 5 toes and instep and heel and arch. Well, I presented this at a science meeting up in Tennessee, and the fellow who had gotten Humanist of the Year that year for trying to explain these away, saying they're just eroded dinosaur tracks, got upset. And he got in a plane, and the next afternoon he was in the river with an iron bar. And when he got through, that track looked like this, which tells you how much he was upset by that. But we, of course, have excellent stereo photographs. We have casts, and it's well documented. This is toward the middle of the trail of now 14 tracks. On up ahead, we see this track. Now you see the 3 toes, the anterior portion of the dinosaur track, but something stepped in the back end of it, doesn't it? Looking at a side view of that, you put the human foot in it, and if you do that, you feel that molded shape. It's very persuasive. Now this one is a right, and directly ahead of it is a left, and it's right, left for 14. This one, when it was first exposed, you could see something going on up here in the upper right-hand corner. Not sure what, but then the next year it had eroded a little more, and yep, there's a dinosaur track right beside it. Some of them are within, some across, and some beside. There's 134 dinosaur tracks on this platform, and there are 14 human tracks going right through the middle of it, like this. We've highlighted the main trail of dinosaur tracks, which goes on about 500 feet back in the opposite direction. Analyzing it, it looks something like this. All of them are at least generally a human shape. The length is really more consistent than the dinosaur tracks, some of which are still in the process of being revealed. 7 of them have individual toes, which is very unusual in fossil tracks. You can distinguish rights from lefts in 12. We did a double blind test at Kansas State University, by the way, in the psych department. Life-size pictures on the table, 14 tracks. What are these? And the question, well, they look like human footprints. Then we got rough on them. Tell us right from left. And 87% agreed with our analysis. We said 12 out of 14 you could determine. That fit just exactly what we predicted. And none of them were consistently different. There's nothing contradictory. Now, this is the way you do science, the way you analyze it. Dawkins sits behind his desk at Oxford and said, no way, and that's the way he does science. But this is really powerful evidence, I believe. Now, the real strength is the fact that there's a sequence, 14, one after the other. You can see some strange things that are produced by erosion. This is a profile in Turkey. I don't know whether you recognize him or not, but maybe you do. How would you distinguish this as a natural erosive process from that which is carved? Well, here's a president here in the mountain, but if you saw 4 presidents in the mountain, you'd be pretty sure that's not erosion. When you see 14 in a right-left pattern, this is certainly not erosion. This is the perfect turvy fossil. It's not intrusional because you can't do that with footprints. You erode them, they're gone. It's not erosional because they're excavated from under the overburden. It's not carved because we see the right-left patterns, not erosion. That just doesn't fit any explanation they can come up with. So what in the world are they going to say? Well, I presented this at a science meeting in Tennessee. We had 50 grad students, the head of the department, University of Tennessee, and got through, and the students looked around at the head of the department. What can you say about this? And he said, well, we don't really know that there weren't dinosaurs back there with human feet. I said, well, I guess that's true. We also don't know there weren't humans back there with dinosaur feet. Wouldn't that make about as much sense? No, he didn't agree. I said, well, these things that look like dinosaur tracks, most reasonable explanation is made by dinosaurs. Well, yeah, I'd agree. Then these things that look like human tracks, most reasonable explanation is made by humans. No, he wouldn't agree with that. I said, well, if they were human, would they look any different? And he got up and left. That was the last of that conversation. Chuck Finsley was curator of the Dallas Museum of Natural History. He came down to look at a dinosaur we'd excavated to see if he could borrow it, put it on display. And we made him look at the footprints, and he got upset and left. But he really wanted that dinosaur, so he came back. The third time he came back, he said, Dr. Patton, I've got your answer. I finally figured this out. He said, I think these things that look like human tracks were made by aliens. Now, he was dead serious, and I kind of snickered, and he got mad. I said, well, now, Chuck, if they're made by aliens, they'd come from a galaxy far, far away, they'd probably be more advanced than we are. What are they doing running around barefooted? And he got mad and left. Dinosaurs with human feet, aliens, or maybe it's what it looks like. How are you supposed to do science? You just follow the facts where they lead. But you can dream up almost anything, maybe an alien dinosaur with human footprints if you want to put it all together. I don't think that's very good science. They did say consistently you need more evidence, and so we excavated that trail of dinosaur tracks, and here's the longest consecutive trail on the American continent. You can't see all of it. You see maybe the little man up there the arrow points to around the corner, continues 500 feet, and beautiful tracks. I think some of the best in the world. We know what dinosaur tracks look like. I think we qualify as people who know that, but what's going across here at about a 30-degree angle is not that. Then there's nothing else to say. Well, you need more evidence. So the platform up ahead, we hadn't excavated, so we excavated it down to that print layer. And sure enough, there's more dinosaur tracks, almost 100 on that platform. And then right in the middle, get this thing to go when I want it to, we see 2 tracks. Now the dinosaurs are different here. They're the hadrosaur, the duckbill with duck-looking feet. And you can see highlighted here the duck shape, and these tracks are slightly raised. The infill is harder, whereas the matrix is eroded away. But look what is over here on the right. Something stepped in the back of it. And wow, you can see that with the mud push-up around it. The dinosaur tracks are raised. This stepped in the infill. Looking at a close-up, you see, yeah, there's that duck-shaped foot that is matched by the mate on the other side, but then in the middle of it, with the mud push-up around it, you can see a perfect footprint. You can even count the knuckles and the toes. Now, that's pretty impressive, especially in a sequence of this time 15 in a right-left pattern, with my beloved standing at the end of the trail. Might recognize it. Then we found another track that actually had been found earlier. We were trying to figure out exactly where it came from and finally identified the spot. It was several hundred yards from this particular trail, but they were sure this one was carved. I mean, that's just too good to be true. And you can see the sectioning lines across. We cut it to see if we could see indications down under the track, which you see here, and we see the distorted material directly under the heel. Carving would cut across the features. The following contours would indicate that's carved. Well, I presented that at a science meeting in Dallas, and they said, well, it must be a real dinosaur track that somebody carved toes on. So we sawed across the toes. Now this is a reach because normally you don't find toes preserved. And sure enough, we found structures under each of the toes, especially here at the great toe. You see the obvious following contours rather than cross-cutting. So, yeah, this one is verified both heel and toe. But the real star of the show now was found in 2008. Oh, wow. But they were just certain this had to be carved. In fact, the fellow who found it didn't see the human track. He just picked it up because it had the dinosaur track in it. It was actually a couple of years later when he got it out and cleaned it up and said, wow, here is a human track. Well, maybe somebody carved that, and we didn't really want to saw across it, so we used a CAT scan and did a virtual slice, or several virtual slices, which you see here. Here is the line right through the slab, and you notice here's the dinosaur toe corresponding to the toe below where the line goes across, and then you see the human toe corresponding here. But look under that human toe, you see the following contours. This is pressed down. This is not carved. So that one is verified as well. If you got humans and dinosaurs stepping in each other's footprints, they're not 100 million years apart. And if they're not, then that geologic column collapses. We find evidence of this around the world. We go down to the Four Corners area, Natural Bridges National Monument. And under one of the beautiful arches there, you see one of my colleagues pointing up to the sheltered area where the Anasazi Indians drew petroglyphs. And here I'm climbing up to where that is, and notice right beside me, we'll highlight it, is a dinosaur which the Indians had drawn, along with the snakes and the shaman and the others. The heavy desert varnish covers it, which takes somewhere around 1,000 years to build up, but it's there, and the Anasazi Indians show their artistry. The comment, probably the leading expert in rock art in our country, says there's a petroglyph, Natural Bridges National Monument, that bears a startling resemblance to a dinosaur, brontosaurus, long tail, neck, head, and all. The second edition just left that out, but that's the way he saw it. We go to Grand Canyon, down now Havasupai Canyon. You see this petroglyph. There was an expedition from the American Museum of Natural History there in 1924 that produced this report. The Daugherty report says Indians were drawing pictures of dinosaurs. I don't think they would have done that today, but they just saw and wrote what they were looking at. This was found fairly recently in the Amazon. Rock art's supposed to be 1,000 years old, and good evidence for that. But here's a dinosaur, men surrounding it, fighting it, looks like, down in it. So it's around the world. We travel to Peru. Dr. Javier Cabrera was one of the better-known scientists in Peru. He performed Peru's first heart transplant, established 3 teaching hospitals, and retired to Inca, and picked up his father's habit of excavating the ancient Inca tombs and collecting the burial stones from those tombs. He has 11,000 of them there in his huge castle, which he somehow got from the conquistadors who came in, and it's a huge castle. Anyway, we did excavate with him with some of these. They were, you see the babies buried with the mothers. Not a pretty picture. Some of the flesh still preserved, the textiles, hair, but notice the stone here, and there are burial stones with these mummies called the Inca burial stones. One of them, looking at a close-up, obviously shows a dinosaur, a man in conflict with a dinosaur. And these are dated to at least 1,500, maybe 2,000 years ago. Now, this particular picture of the Brontosaurus type, Apatosaurus, shows the stair steps across the back, the dermal frills, which we didn't know about till 1991 when it was first published. When Mr. Sinclair showed his representation of this dinosaur, he didn't have the stair steps, but 1,000 years ago down in Peru, they knew about them and represented them correctly. Some of them are large, some are small, all different types of materials, but you can see the thousands that are collected. About a third of all of them have dinosaurs on them. Here you see one in the upper right-hand corner with the man's foot in his mouth, shades of Jurassic Park. Some are very dramatic and obvious. Some are rather cartoonish, and some are very classically, beautifully done. The mummies are wrapped in burial cloths, and some of them have the dinosaur motif on them. So the burial cloths, the stones, as well as the pottery that's found in the tombs, all date to as much as 2,000 years ago. This particular piece is in the National Museum in Lima, which is dated circa 2,500 years old. This is a Turvey fossil, the very thing that he said would refute evolution. We go from there down to central Mexico in Acambaro, the Central Highlands. Dr. Swift, doctorate in archaeology, and I were investigating this. We've made 5 trips over the years. There's one collection of over 30,000 figurines that's supposed to date 4,000 years ago, and for good reason. Strange looking critters, but about 2,000 of the 30,000 are of dinosaurs, dating to 4,000 years ago, both culturally and with thermoluminescent dating. That's a very obvious Turvey fossil. You're not supposed to know what dinosaurs looked like 1,000 years ago. We've known for maybe 100 or 150. And then they've been gone 65 million, is the story in the textbook. Some of them were standing up, which we didn't know about till Spielberg taught us that, looking at his movie. But they knew about it over 1,000 years ago. Some of them just extremely obvious. And with 2,000, we won't take time to show you all of those, but these are some of the most dramatic. This is my wife's favorite. Of course, you don't have to have the human and the dinosaur together to know that it represents both human and dinosaur. But it makes it pretty obvious when they are together. Then let's travel to France. She doesn't go with me down to Mexico or some of the more exotic places, but we fly into Paris. Yep, she's ready to go. Here at the Louvre, we find representations of dinosaurs all over the place from well over 1,000 years ago. Here is Sir George fighting the dragon. Close-up shows the scales and the claws and the teeth. I mean, that's just a T-Rex. Some of the representations are slightly different. This one's from Germany. But Sir George was killing a dinosaur. Now, he is a historical figure. We know where he's buried. He was one of the Crusaders who died in Palestine. I've been to his tomb and seen where he was buried. Interestingly, the BBC did a special on that recently, 10 things you might not know about George, and that's just running away with itself here. There's no mistaking the link to St. George, a golden statue of the saint slaying a dragon, dominating Tbilisi's central square. Now, dragon, as we pointed out Sunday, is like or Monday was the word I think the King James used when it should have been dinosaur, which of course wasn't invented at that time. In Central Square in Tbilisi, ancient Georgia, Soviet Georgia, you see Sir George up on top with the dinosaur that he's killing, and that's where Georgia got its name. It's all about killing a dinosaur. That's what it looks like. And then you look at the seal of the nation of Georgia. The flag is the Crusader flag from Sir George, who was killed in Palestine. No mistaking that link to St. George. He's also a patron saint, and the national flag featuring his red cross and white background is everywhere. Wikipedia describes St. George as the Crusader. This is not just a myth. And they've got several pictures along with it from all over the countrysides. The one describing the fact that he is celebrated on a special day honoring St. George in England says he's patron saint not only of England, but Beirut, Bulgaria, Ethiopia, Georgia, Greece, Lithuania, Malta, Palestine, Portugal, Siberia, Venice. I mean, Sir George is well known with coins and flags throughout Europe. Here is from 15th century Barcelona, Spain, a picture of Sir George killing the dinosaur. Now, Georgia over here in the U.S., people don't know that's about killing dinosaurs, but that's maybe we need to tell them that. And he is all over the world. In fact, this afternoon over in Weston, I looked across and there is St. George, the hotel. We need to let them know that's about killing dinosaurs. That's where that came from. Travel back here to France, and down in the southern part, we see Chateau de Chambord with my wife in her backyard. At least she was traveling with me then. 700 dinosaurs carved on this castle. Here's one of them. You can see a close-up, and obviously the scales and the claws, the long neck, and they're all over the ceilings and the walls, in ceiling tiles over 700. And it's supposed to have been a hunting lodge built by Francis I, King of France. And it makes you wonder what he was hunting, doesn't it? We're looking here at one of the ceiling tiles up close, and we compare that with the Plateosaurus found in the Harvard Museum of Natural History. You look at the heads and wow, that's a dead ringer, a Plateosaurus. This is over the fireplace there in Chateau de Chambord. We traveled to Chateau de Bois, about 15 kilometers to the south. A little earlier, this is from the 12th century BC, and there are dinosaurs all over it. You see the arrows pointing to the dinosaurs. In the throne room of Chateau de Bois, you see this picture. There's the dragon with the scales. We compare that to Dracorex hogwartia, discovered in 2007, described by Bob Barker of Harvard. Dracorex hogwartia, named for Harry Potter, is dragon. But looking at the head of the dragon on this tapestry in the throne room from the 12th century, we see Dracorex hogwartia, found in 2007, that just matches. Look at the restoration of Dracorex hogwartia. It looks a lot like a dragon, doesn't it? Also on the tapestry, we find the juvenile hadrosaur, the little duck-billed dinosaur, compared with what we see as pictures on the internet. Matches pretty well, doesn't it? So, yes, in France, you see evidences of dinosaurs not that long ago. You go to Reims Cathedral in the Tau Palace, and you see depicted Eve and the serpent. Wow, is that what the serpent looked like? He had legs, but then the curse changed that. But this is the way, with, I guess, the apple in his mouth. Here is a picture depicted by Leonardo Da Vinci in the 1500s. He's drawing a picture of a dragon. Where did that idea come from? Looks like a dinosaur to me. That's in Buckingham Palace. You look at the description of Marco Polo and his travels around the world. Now, this is not an illustration he drew, but this is my representation with him. But see if that doesn't fit the description that you find from Marco Polo. Huge serpents, 10 paces in length, that's 50 feet. Forepart near the head, they have 2 short legs, each with 3 claws. The jaws are wide enough to swallow a man. Teeth are large and sharp. Their whole appearance is so formidable, neither man nor any kind of animal can approach them without terror. I got a pretty good idea what he was talking about. Travel with me to Cambodia. The Khmer Empire was one of the largest, most advanced in ancient civilization over 1,000 years ago. But one of the temples here, Tapram, back in the jungle, which was a Buddhist monastery, dedicated in 1186, has carvings, stone carvings all over it. You can see some of them there, standing there in the doorway, but looking closely at the column just inside the front doorway are monkeys and deer and Stegosaurus. I don't think any 12-year-old kid around here would miss what that is. Looking at the close-up here, we see more proof of the co-occurrence of humans and dinosaurs. Had one smart aleck saying, well, you got 2 dinosaurs in that picture, but you got man and human and dinosaurs together. What does that mean? Let's let the evolutionists describe to us the significance. This is Louis Jacobs, President of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. He said evolution would be vanquished, and in the handout we have the full quote. Stephen Stanley, we referred to earlier, said it would disprove evolution. Jerry Cohn, a vicious anti-creationist, University of Chicago, it would be an ugly fact that would kill Darwinism. Our friend Richard Dawkins says evolution would be utterly destroyed, evolution disproved. In Newsweek, he said it would blow the theory of evolution out of the water if you find humans and dinosaurs together. Well, you'll have to decide if we have done that. This is a model to be tested. It's a mental abstraction that you don't find when you dig down in the earth. It's representation of the circular logic, but it's useful as a model. Okay, we compare it as a model to the real world, and we see all kinds of contradictions that we've shown you. And we'll back that up just a second so you can see that better. Some of the examples that we've shown you that absolutely contradict it. It doesn't make a very good model when time after time after time it doesn't fit. Things at the bottom found up, things at the top found down. That's what Stanley said would disprove it. It's interesting to see the reaction, and we'll conclude with what Nova had to say. They came down to Glen Rose, filmed it. The photographers were very excited. Earth-shaking evidence here. And it was killed. They would not publish any of them. But they did put out a short video, Darwin and the Dinosaurs, referring to dinosaurs side by side with humans, saying nothing like that at Glen Rose. There's nothing that looks like a human footprint, said flatly. Well, I beg to differ. We've got plenty of things that look like human footprints, side by side with the humans. The reason they deny, finding them would counter evidence that humans evolved long after the dinosaurs became extinct, and back up the claim that all species, including man, were created at one time. Now, that's why they deny the obvious. I think it's obvious. You'll have to decide that for yourself. If it is obvious, then there's proof, as acknowledged by the evolutionists themselves, utterly destroying evolution. They'll talk about aliens and humans with dinosaur feet or dinosaurs with human feet. Anything but humans and dinosaurs together. All right, I think I may have 3 minutes left. Let's see if some of you may have some questions. Anybody have a question? Everybody understand all of that? Who has a question? Surprised you with the questions tonight? Yes.
There's another dinosaur park that was found near San Antonio, and I heard the description of a man who was there right after it was discovered. They said they had brought out a full dinosaur out of the tar pit. Any word out of those things?
We've got several complete dinosaurs that we found in Texas. That's one. There is, not too far from the Llano Uplift, a series of dinosaur tracks together, and there are humans there as well in those tracks. There's some in Russia, some in Turkmenistan. So we've just scratched the surface.
Are you still taking questions? Okay, so what do the historians say about those hieroglyphs, those carvings, and that art that they're showing? Are they saying that's mythology from the 12th century, the 16th century? How are they saying they know what dinosaurs actually look like? How are they explaining that?
You would have a hard time imagining. I remember speaking fairly recently to a curator of the Price Museum, Archaeological Museum in Utah, and I showed him some of the pictures of the petroglyphs, and he said, well, yes, I've seen those, and he knew of some that I didn't know about. I knew of 4 that we showed him. He said, well, maybe they were smoking some of those funny mushrooms and dreamed up a 100-million-year-old dream, I guess. I don't know. That's what he said. It's embarrassing for him. Yes.
Are there any people that you've been involved with believe in the Bible?
Most of them do not, and would be very antagonistic. And that's the reason. Some of them will say it plainly. I don't. When Dwayne Gish was debating Theodosius Dobzhansky in Berkeley, he asked him after the debate, because he had really just, in my estimation, mopped up the floor with Dobzhansky, the evolutionist. Why are you such a glutton for punishment? Why do you keep defending this when it's not defensible? And there were 3 people there that heard this, so this is not just rumor, it's established. He said, well, I've got 3 girlfriends and I'm not going to give them up. Now, that's not true of all evolutionists. Many have just heard one side and that's all they've seen. And so we've got work to do. There are people that are what they are as evolutionists because they're honest and they follow the facts. And we need to get them the rest of the evidence, but you understand why the leaders don't want the rest of the evidence known. All right, our time is up, and we thank you very much for your attention. By the way, this